Usually when you look at a medical diagnosis,
Hmm.
there is this expectation of strict binary precision.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
you look at an X-ray of a fractured radius and you see that jagged white line, and it just looks like a snapped steel girder. I mean,
Yeah.
it's either broken or it's not.
Exactly. It's very black and white.
But the moment you look past that static two-dimensional image and actually observe the human body in motion, you realize that bone is not a piece of structural steel. It is this highly sensitive, living, adapting tissue.
It really is. The way the body moves, the way it absorbs and distributes mechanical forces every single day. It's just a marvel of biological engineering.
Yeah, completely.
And it forces a complete paradigm shift for anyone working in clinical practice. When you start viewing human anatomy through the lens of physics and biomechanics, you stop simply cataloging what is torn or broken. You start deciphering the precise kinetic chain of events that caused the structural failure in the first place. You're looking at the math behind the biology.
Which is exactly the lens we are applying to our deep dives today. For those of you listening who spend your days analyzing human movement, whether you are a medical student in a gross anatomy lab or working in physical therapy or deep in orthopedic research, we are taking the principles from the biomechanics literature today.
Specifically, we're basing this on the 4th edition of Biomechanical Basis of Human Movement by Hamel, Knudsen, and Derrick.
Yes, great textbook. We are looking at the mechanics of human movement and tearing them down to the studs. I mean, our mission here is to see how abstract physical laws dictate the survival of our tissues.
That's a great way to frame it.
So we're going to build human movement from the ground up. We'll start with the skeletal scaffolding, then add the muscular engine, wire up the neurological control system, and finally analyze the mathematical output of that movement. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the bones. Because before a body can move, it needs a structure that can actually handle extreme physical forces without, just collapsing.
Right. And that biological survival begins with the structural integrity of bone and connective tissue. In any mechanical system, you have to evaluate how materials handle loads. And we do this by looking at the stress-strain relationship.
So stress and strain, walk us through that.
Well, stress is basically the mechanical force applied per unit area. It's the load on the tissue. And strain is the resulting deformation, so the change in length compared to the tissue's resting state.
Okay, got it.
When you plot these two against each other on a graph, you map out the absolute physical limits of the tissue.
I think most of us are familiar with the elastic region of that curve. Like you apply a load to a ligament, it deforms, and when the load is removed, the mechanical energy is fully recovered. The tissue just returns to its original length.
Exactly, just like a rubber band.
Right. So the elastic region is like stretching a rubber band. But if you push past the yield point, you hit the plastic region, which is kind of like bending a plastic spoon until it stays bent, right before it snaps entirely at the failure point.
That's a really good analogy, yeah. The failure point is where you see the macroscopic tear or fracture.
But I want to push back on that for a second. Let's pause on that plastic region, because we aren't actually talking about bending a plastic spoon. What is physically happening at the microscopic level when biological tissue, like a ligament, enters the plastic region?
That's the crucial difference. At the microscopic level, you are seeing the failure of individual collagen fibers. The cross-links that give the tissue its tensile strength are literally micro-tearing.
Ouch.
Yeah. The tissue hasn't completely snapped in two, which is why it hasn't reached the macro failure point, but the structural matrix is compromised. It loses its stiffness. And this is where we have to totally discard the mental model of human tissue behaving like metal or hard plastic. Bones, tendons, and ligaments are viscoelastic.
Viscoelastic, meaning they have both fluid-like and solid-like properties simultaneously, right?
Precisely. Unlike simple metals, their mechanical response, how stiff or compliant they are, is completely dependent on the rate of loading.
I always think of this like a non-Newtonian fluid. If you have a bowl of cornstarch and water, and you press your hand into it slowly, it feels like a liquid and your hand just sinks to the bottom. But if you punch that same bowl violently, the mixture instantly hardens and it feels like a brick wall.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. If you apply a force slowly to a bone, it is relatively compliant. It absorbs the energy over time. But if a patient suffers a sudden high-velocity impact, like a car collision or a fall from a height, the fluid components within the tissue matrix resist that sudden displacement.
So the bone literally gets stiffer.
Yes, the bone becomes significantly stiffer and can withstand a much higher peak force before fracturing.
And the architecture of the bone itself is designed to manage those forces too, right? Because we have the dense cortical bone on the outer shafts of long bones, which handles immense compressive stress. But then at the ends of those bones, near the joints, we transition into cancellous or spongy bone, which is over 70% porous. Why do we need that structural shift right at the joint?
Energy dissipation. If our long bones were made entirely of solid cortical bone, the transfer of kinetic energy from, say, a heel strike straight up through the knee and hip, it would shatter the joints over time.
Because it's too rigid.
Exactly. Cancellous bone has this honeycomb-like trabecular structure, and those trabeculae align themselves perfectly along the lines of mechanical stress. As forces travel through the joint, that porous structure microbends and actually absorbs the shock.
And that alignment isn't an accident. It is constantly being remodeled, right?
Yeah.
You have osteoblasts building new bone tissue and osteoclasts resorbing it. The mechanical loads we put on the body literally dictate its geometry.
They really do. Take the femoral neck of the hip, for example. When you are just standing there, gravity is pushing the pelvis down, and the ground reaction force is pushing the femur up. You end up with these massive compressive forces on the inferior side of the femoral neck.
But the superior side is actually being stretched, right? It's under tension.
Which perfectly illustrates why the trabecular patterns in the femoral neck actually cross each other at right angles. One set aligns to resist compression, the other to resist tension.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is how this introduces the danger of fatigue loading. When a runner, for example, abruptly increases their mileage, they are applying thousands of repetitive loads to that skeletal structure.
I'm guessing the osteoblasts simply cannot lay down new bone fast enough to repair the microscopic damage.
Exactly. The injury threshold on the stress strain curve actually drops. The bone literally fatigues. A load that was well within the elastic region a month ago is suddenly enough to push the weakened tissue into the plastic region.
Resulting in a stress fracture.
Right. The tissue hasn't changed its fundamental material properties, but its tolerance has been eroded by the frequency of the mechanical stress.
So we have this brilliant viscoelastic structure that constantly adapts its own density to survive. But a scaffold is completely static on its own. To generate motion across our highly mobile diarthrodial or synovial joints, we need an engine.
The skeletal muscle system.
Exactly. The textbook highlights 4 distinct properties of muscle tissue: irritability, contractility, extensibility, and elasticity. But I'd love for you to translate these textbook definitions into clinical realities. Specifically, looking at the dynamic relationship between force and velocity.
Yeah, let's break that down. The force-velocity relationship is one of the most critical principles in all of biomechanics. Let's look at a concentric muscle action first, where the muscle fibers are generating tension while physically shortening. There is an absolute inverse relationship between the force a muscle can produce and the velocity at which it can shorten.
Meaning, if you are trying to lift an incredibly heavy load, you can only move it slowly. But if the load is light, you can move it fast. Most people know that intuitively from, just being in a gym.
Right.
But what is the cellular mechanism that's actually enforcing that speed limit?
It comes down to the physical time required for the cross-bridge cycle to occur. For a muscle to contract, the myosin heads have to physically attach to the actin filaments, perform a power stroke to pull the filaments closer together, detach, and then reset. That entire biochemical process takes fractions of a millisecond.
So if you're moving too fast,
If the muscle is shortening very rapidly, the actin binding sites are just moving past the myosin heads way too fast. Fewer cross bridges have the time to physically attach at any given moment, and fewer attachments mean less total force.
that makes perfect sense for a concentric load. But here's where it gets really interesting. I want to look at eccentric loads, where the muscle is lengthening while under tension, like controlling a heavy weight on the way down, or your quadriceps decelerating your body weight as you walk down a steep hill.
Right, eccentric actions.
If the microscopic purpose of those myosin heads is to grab the actin and pull inward to shorten, how does an eccentric load not just instantly shear all those microscopic structures right off? I mean, you are mechanically forcing a contracting tissue to stretch apart.
It is a biomechanical paradox, honestly, and the muscle fibers would absolutely be destroyed if they were operating in isolation, but they aren't. This is where we have to look beyond the sarcomere and examine the surrounding connective tissue.
The epimysium.
Yes, the epimysium wrapping the muscle and the tendons connecting it to the bone. Tendons act as series elastic components.
Ah, so they are like the shock absorbers for the muscle fibers.
Precisely. When a high-force eccentric load is applied, The tendon, thanks to its viscoelastic properties, stretches and absorbs a massive portion of that sudden mechanical energy.
It elongates first.
Yes, which delays the rapid stretching of the muscle fibers themselves. By storing that energy elastically, the tendon protects the cross bridges from being violently sheared apart by the external force. It's essentially protecting the muscle during that eccentric elongation.
Which is incredible. We have the bones to support us and the muscles to move us. But an engine that generates force is useless without a sophisticated control system to regulate it. The nervous system doesn't just turn muscles on and off. It is the software that orchestrates everything with unbelievable precision through motor units.
Yeah, the motor unit is the fundamental unit of neuromuscular control. It's a single alpha motor neuron and all the specific muscle fibers it innervates. The central nervous system essentially uses two primary strategies to control force output: the size principle and rate coding.
The size principle being that the body always recruits the smallest slow-twitch type 1 motor units first.
Right.
And if the load is light, it only uses what it needs. But as the mechanical demand increases, it starts recruiting the larger type 2A and eventually type 2B fast-twitch motor units. It is a perfect energy conservation strategy.
It really is. And the second strategy, rate coding, involves the frequency of the electrical signals. A single action potential causes a tiny muscle twitch. But if the nervous system fires action potentials rapidly enough, the muscle fiber doesn't have time to fully relax between signals.
So the mechanical tension physically stacks up.
Yes. The calcium remains in the sarcomere, the cross bridges stay active, and the force of the twitches summates until it reaches a state of maximum sustained force, which we call tetanus.
So let's take this neurological software and apply it to a practical scenario for the medical professionals listening. Say a physical therapist is working with a patient trying to increase their flexibility. Biomechanically, they're trying to lengthen the tissue. But neurologically, why do they need to care about reflexes? Why does the body sometimes violently resist being stretched?
Well, because the nervous system is running this constant subconscious security protocol via proprioceptive reflexes. Within the muscle fibers themselves, you have muscle spindles. These are sensory receptors that detect two things: changes in muscle length and the velocity of that change.
So if you force a joint into a stretch too quickly,
The spindles detect a rapid, dangerous elongation. They send an afferent signal to the spinal cord, and the gamma loop immediately fires back, triggering a reflexive, powerful contraction in that exact same muscle. It's the stretch reflex.
so the nervous system contracts the muscle to prevent it from tearing, which means if a clinician just pulls harder, the muscle spindles are just going to fight them harder.
Exactly. You are working entirely against the therapist.
So you have to find a way to bypass the security system.
Which you can do if you understand a second proprioceptor, the Golgi tendon organ, or GTO. While muscle spindles detect length, GTOs are located in the tendon, and they detect purely mechanical tension. Their job is to prevent the muscle from generating so much force that it avulses the tendon right off the bone.
So if tension gets too high, the GTOs step in and just shut the whole operation down.
Right, they trigger autogenic inhibition. They send an inhibitory signal that completely overrides the muscle spindle, forcing the muscle to instantly relax. Clinicians exploit this mechanism through techniques like PNF stretching or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation.
Where you have the patient actively contract the muscle you're trying to stretch, right?
Exactly. By having the patient actively and maximally contract the tight muscle against resistance, you artificially spike the tension in the tendon. The GTOs sense this extreme tension, fire their inhibitory signals, and the moment the patient stops contracting, the muscle is neurologically forced into a relaxed state.
The security system is temporarily disabled, and you can safely push the joint into a new range of motion. That is just brilliant.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this explains why electromyography, or EMG, is so vital in biomechanics. It allows us to record these precise electrical signals to analyze muscle activation. Though we do have to account for electromechanical delay. The electrical signal hits the muscle, but it takes a fraction of a second for the chemical cascade to actually generate measurable physical tension in the tissue.
Right. And that interplay between the electrical input and the mechanical output is the perfect bridge into the final layer of our analysis today, measuring the actual movement mathematically. When we analyze human movement clinically or in research, we are essentially looking at kinematics and kinetics.
Yes, the mechanical output.
Just to clarify the distinction for the listener, kinematics is the geometry of motion.
Yeah.
We're talking displacement, velocity, acceleration, absolute versus relative angles. It's what the motion simply looks like. But kinetics That's the forces actually causing the motion.
Right.
Contact versus non-contact forces, Newton's laws, torque, levers.
Exactly, the math behind the motion.
So what does this all mean? How do we apply this math to functional anatomy and real clinical pathologies mentioned in the text? Let's start with the functional biomechanics of the spine. The vertebral column is essentially a modified elastic rod, right?
It is. It has to support massive compressive loads while maintaining multiplanar flexibility. But when the kinetics, the physical forces applied to it, exceed its structural tolerance, things go wrong.
Like a young athlete chronically lifting excessive weight with poor mechanics, the compressive loads on the lumbar vertebrae are immense.
They are. And while the intervertebral discs are fantastic at absorbing those compressive loads by dissipating the force outward, there is a limit. If the compressive kinetic force is too violent or repeated too often, the nucleus pulposus in the center of the disc doesn't just herniate outward. It can actually rupture vertically, punching right through the vertebral end plate and into the spongy cancellous bone of the adjacent vertebra.
We call those Schmorl's nodes. Or it's also linked to conditions like Shorterman's disease. You're literally crushing the disc into the bone above or below it.
Yes, it is a direct structural failure resulting from unmanaged kinetic loads.
And if we move down the kinetic chain, the lower extremity has to manage incredibly complex angular kinematics too. The knee joint, for instance, isn't just a simple door hinge. As the knee approaches full extension during the swing phase of walking, the geometry of the medial and lateral femoral condyles forces the tibia to rotate externally.
Ah, the screw-home mechanism.
Yeah.
That slight rotation locks the knee joint into its most stable position so it can safely accept the weight of the body during heel strike.
But think about what happens if a patient has an anatomical deviation that disrupts that precise kinematic tracking. If the tibia isn't rotating correctly, you drastically alter the contact area under the kneecap. Over thousands of steps, that abnormal loading and aberrant kinetic friction begins to shred the cartilage on the underside of the patella.
Leading to pathologies like chondromalacia patellae. Or even at the hip, abnormal loading can lead to things like Legg-Calvé-Perthes disease, which is the degeneration of the femoral head. It highlights that joint degeneration is rarely a sudden event. It is usually the result of a long-term kinematic error amplifying kinetic friction.
Wow. And we see the extreme end of kinematic and kinetic coordination in the upper extremity too, particularly in throwing sports. A baseball pitcher throwing a fastball is just an absolute masterclass in physics.
Truly, to generate maximum velocity at the hand, the body has to sequentially transfer angular momentum through the joints. It starts with the large, forceful muscles of the lower body. As the trunk rotates and decelerates, that momentum is transferred to the shoulder, then to the elbow, and finally to the wrist.
But the shoulder complex has to carefully manage its own internal geometry during all of this, specifically the scapulohumeral rhythm. As the humerus elevates, the scapula must upwardly rotate. If it doesn't rotate out of the way, the humerus slams right into the acromion process, crushing the rotator cuff tendons.
Exactly. And furthermore, watch the kinematics of the pitcher's arm. As they accelerate forward, they intentionally bend the elbow. By bringing the mass of the forearm closer to the axis of rotation at the shoulder, they dramatically decrease their moment of inertia.
Oh, right. According to the conservation of angular momentum, a smaller moment of inertia results in a massive increase in angular velocity.
Exactly. They are manipulating physics to whip the arm forward at speeds that would otherwise be impossible.
It is the exact same principle as an ice skater pulling their arms in to spin faster, just applied to the violent mechanics of a single joint, which really brings everything full circle. Today, we've looked at the microscopic viscoelasticity of our skeletal scaffolding, the force-velocity mechanics of our muscular engine, the precise neurological rate coding and inhibition that protects our tissues, and the complex kinematic and kinetic analyses that allow us to understand movement.
It's a lot to process, but before we conclude, there's one final provocative biomechanical concept that I think every listener should deeply ponder.
Let's hear it.
Earlier, we discussed how viscoelastic tissues like tendons and cartilage absorb energy, but they are not perfectly elastic. When a load is applied, the tissue deforms. When the load is removed and it returns to its resting shape, a small percentage of that mechanical energy is not recovered. It is actually lost into the surrounding tissue as heat.
Ah, the concept of hysteresis. The mechanical energy lost as heat when a tissue is deformed.
Correct. And while the amount of heat generated from a single step is microscopically small, consider the scale, over a lifetime of walking, running, and lifting. What is the cumulative biological cost of hysteresis? Every single day, your cartilage is subjected to thousands of loading cycles. Could this microscopic daily loss of mechanical energy, this relentless low-grade thermal degradation, be the hidden catalyst for degenerative joint diseases like osteoarthritis?
That is a staggering way to view joint wear and tear. It fundamentally shifts the perspective from blunt mechanical trauma to this lifelong, inescapable biological cost. It's a fascinating thought to leave on. And to make sure you, the listener, are walking away with these concepts permanently wired into your clinical thinking, I want to leave you with a quick review exercise.
Good idea.
Imagine a patient presents with equinus, which is a severe limitation in ankle dorsiflexion, usually due to a tight Achilles tendon. Based on today's session, how would this alter the angular kinematics of their knee during walking? And from a neurological standpoint, how would you design a PNF stretching protocol to bypass the muscle spindle reflex, activate the Golgi tendon organs, and safely lengthen that tendon?
It is a critical exercise. It forces you to link the structural limitation to the kinetic chain and then apply the neurological hack to treat it.
Exactly. Take the time to map out the mechanics of that specific scenario. Apply this biomechanical lens to your next clinical rotation or your next training session. Suddenly, the human body isn't just a collection of anatomical names to memorize. It is a living, breathing map of forces and incredible adaptations.
Keep questioning the mechanics of the systems in front of you.
Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you on the next deep dive.